This is finally beginning to happen. But for the longest time, whenever anyone would use the phrase climate change, that in itself was a code for too much CO2 in the atmosphere because of the burning of fossil fuels. So it was all up there in the atmosphere. And land was forgotten.
Good evening and welcome. So STEAM at Cambridge Public Library, it falls under the umbrella of a citywide initiative across Cambridge tied with the Department of Human Service Programs and the Cambridge Public Schools. And this partnership is a commitment that all residents will engage in high quality STEAM learnings. That's science, technology, engineering, arts and design, and math.
How many people are discouraged about the state of the environment and climate? Let's see, everybody's hand is up, my goodness. Well, that's why you're here tonight, because we are going to undiscourage you, and I'll tell you right now that the biggest obstacle to addressing climate and our various ecological disasters, which are daunting, there's no question, but the biggest obstacle is despair, because there are so many things we can do, and that's why we have Judy here tonight to tell you about the positive work that people are doing all over the world. And I would just put in a plug for our conference in April, and you can pick up a card that tells you more. It's called Blessed Unrest. And it's about the incredible things people all over the world are doing that we never hear about in the mainstream news, but are of critical importance.
Thanks to all of you. It's great to be here, great to see you here. And just to kind of let you know how this is going to go, it's a little three-ring circus-ish. So I'm going to speak for just a little while, and then having brought my own curious person to learn about Earth repair, Nicola will come up and we're going to chat and have a dialogue about some of these topics and kind of get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty, and then we will open it up to all of you. So basically, what this is about, this is an invitation to look at our many challenges from a perspective in which we have agency, because, what I often say is that it's the way that we talk about our problems that interferes with our ability to do anything about them. So let's open up how we see our challenges. One important thing that so far has been absent from our conversations, our public conversations around climate, is the role of functioning ecosystems in climate regulation. And once we start to open up that reality, because we know that we can restore ecosystems, even large-scale degraded ecosystems, then we can begin to rebuild climate regulation, rebuild biodiversity, rebuild food security, all of these things. And also, at least as important, in Adam's words, is transcend the challenge of despair. This, by the way, that's my spirit animal. It's a hermit thrush, and I live in Vermont. And it is the most beautiful, has the most beautiful song ever. So, Adam mentioned that I have a new book coming out, and that is about the growing global ecosystem restoration movement, which is really exciting and really, really kind of under the radar right now. Hopefully this will change, because the United Nations has declared the next decade, 2021 to 2030, the decade on ecosystem restoration. Has anyone heard of that? Yeah. Okay, so some people have heard of that. So I'm hoping, and I know they're hoping, that this will bring ecological restoration to the fore. but I'm also really encouraged because of all that I've been seeing around the world. So I'm going to I just picked a few different examples, and so I'll tell you a couple of stories that I mentioned, mostly that I mentioned in the book, and some that are just stories I happen to like. Okay, so here we have a plot of land. This is after a rainfall in western Saudi Arabia. So I learned about this project. Okay, so now I'm just going to leap ahead. This is the same land about 2 months ago. So there's a really interesting fellow named Neil Spackman who happened to have studied Arabic, and because he knew Arabic, he was brought into a kind of multifaceted project in western Saudi Arabia to help the Bedouin communities that were in dire poverty, have no place to live. I mean, these were people that had been following their animal herds, but because of the degradation of the land, they could no longer do that. They were on public assistance and really in pretty serious straits. So he came into this project and he said, I would like to have a permaculture component to this. I would like to have an ecological component. So he got together a team of 4 Bedouin people. He said it started out at about 20 because it looked like there might be a paycheck involved. And then when everyone saw how much work this was going to be, anyway, it came down to 4, 2 older men and 2 younger men. Now, this project is really extraordinary because they did this work. They did a lot of planting, a lot of tree planting, and they had to wait until it rained before the conditions were conducive for the planting. The challenge is that it might go more than a year without rain. So they kind of, they built all the waterworks, the berms and the swales, waiting for the rain. And then when it rained, they did the planting. They rushed out and they did all this. So I think the first planting was in something like 2011. Then, it rained a little. Okay, so these trees got a start, and they were using irrigation from the water that they harvested. So in 2016, in August of 2016, the project ran out of money. So they were no longer irrigating. And Neil and his team said, gosh, we had a good run. I guess we just have to turn off the irrigation and just hope that that either it will rain again soon or that we have enough of a system underground that's supporting these trees. So 2 years later, after a ½ inch of rain over that 2 years, 80% of those trees survived. So they really know that this is possible. This is part of the world where it's like the driest part of the world. So, and now there's an area of it that looks like that. You can see that the land has really come to life from where it was then. Okay, and then here, this is an example of how they would kind of hold the moisture and hold the soil so that the biodiversity could get, settled and put the grass up. This, I'll just tell a little story. This is a book, anyway, I guess the reproduction didn't work, but I wonder if any of you have heard of a woman named Isabella Tree and a book called Wilding? Okay, some of you have. Okay, so this is a whole other paradigm. One of the things that's really exciting is that there's no one-size-fits-all to land restoration. Depending on where you are, depending on what the challenges are, there are different approaches, and rewilding is really, really taking off in Europe. And so her story is that her husband inherited a lot of land, and it had been used for farming, even though the soil was really, really thick and muddy and unworkable. And after after they were doing this year after year, they kept putting more money into it and more big equipment, and they weren't earning anything, and they were miserable, and the land looked like hell. They said, let's do something else. So they chose to give the land back to nature. Now that sounds very idyllic, like, oh, just let it go, and we'll just come back and it'll be the Garden of Eden. What they did was they did this very mindfully, working with scientists who were able to help them figure out what animals had been in this kind of landscape, what animals' activities would help revive this landscape in a way that is the most, that brings it to the greatest fruition. And what is wonderful is that the results greatly exceeded anything that they could have expected. And Isabella tells wonderful stories in her book and in her talks about how creatures, birds and insects and lovely butterflies that hadn't been seen in this region for decades just suddenly came in. It's just a beautiful articulation of the notion that if you create the conditions, nature will return and rebound. And this is just a picture. Now we are in China, okay? This is in the Loess Plateau in China. And these photos, this is 14 years later, were taken by someone named John Liu, a filmmaker who you may have heard of. So the story here, again, totally different because this was a very top-down operation. So this landscape, this huge, huge area of land about the size of France was completely degraded. You had just people were in dire poverty, living in caves. I heard horrible stories about, grandparents refusing to take food so that their grandchildren could have a chance to grow. I mean, it was horrible conditions. So the Chinese government said, okay, well, there were two things. Okay, one is that because of the land degradation and the erosion, all the soil was washing off into the Yellow River and causing tremendous problems there. And then there was the population. I mean, they could support these people forever and have them live in this subsistence way. But maybe if they really worked to restore the land, they could help these people have livelihoods and better lives and reduce the erosion into the Yellow River. And that is what happened. And John Liu has films when he talks to people about the before and after, and just that people have been able to reclaim their dignity, and you have regained ecological function. I mean, it's just so different. And it's an incredible story because a quantity of land, an expanse of land about the size of Belgium was restored to ecological function. So that's how we know that we can do this not only in a permaculture spot in someone's backyard, but also on a large scale. And that is really important to know. Now, here's another, I'm going to introduce you to another modality of land restoration, and that is holistic management, holistic planned grazing. And some of you may have heard of someone named Alan Savory, who gave a TED Talk that's been seen by millions of people. And also the title of my book, Cows Save the Planet. I mean, it's a book about soil, but I wanted to get people's attention. People say, how can cows save the planet? Well, what this is about is that the grasslands of the world, and we're talking about 40% or 40, a little more, a little less percent of the landmass of our planet is natural grasslands. And the insights that Alan Savory came to is that grasslands and grazing animals co-evolved so that the land needs the animals in the same way that the animals need the land. And also that land can be undergrazed as well as overgrazed. In other words, that the land needs certain kind of animal impact. That doesn't mean that you can just put animals on land and everything will be dandy, because in nature, those grazing animals were managed by predators. But in most of our ecosystems now, we don't have the optimal balance of predators and prey animals. So basically, the humans become the managers of, and we act as the prey in that we are keeping the animals moving so that land does not get too much impact, but it gets enough. So this is about 30 years difference, and this is in Mexico, in the state of Coahuila, northern Mexico. And this is about 30 years later. I don't think it took 30 years for it to restore, but one question that I often like to ask people is so this is the same land, which has more water, this one or this picture? Yes. And why I like to ask that is that when we think about how much water is in the landscape, often we're thinking about ponds or lakes or streams, but actually the most important water for ecological function is what we could call green water, or water held in the soil. And then just another example of holistic management this is another before and after. I think this is about 15 years, maybe 20 years difference. This is in Australia. And this fellow that I interviewed, I have a chapter on Australia in Water in Plain Sight. His name is Chris Hengler. And I love the way that he thinks about things. So he manages a tract of land that is the size of the 5 boroughs of New York. So obviously he's not on his own with his family intending to impact the whole land. They choose sites. So they're working with minimizing, they're rebuilding the land. He considers his product restored land. And they are one of the most pressing aspects of that is creating fire resilience. And they're doing some really, really creative things with wild donkeys as well as cattle. And it's very interesting to see the synergies between different kinds of animals and what they do in the landscape. So that was an introduction to the kinds of things that are just a real snippet. And now, let's chat. Nicola?
So I have a bunch of questions after perusing over the holidays through Judy's books, which is obviously out there as well. And I just really like her approach in telling stories, and so that it breaks it down so that we can have a better understanding. So I have a bunch of questions, and my first one, you mentioned, Judy, that the UN General Assembly declared the decade of ecosystem restoration. Do you have any further reflections on that?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, because I was able to go to a big meeting, a couple of meetings during New York Climate Week, where they're starting to put together their plans for it. And I was really encouraged, because what I was seeing is that it's not a top-down, but that at least the people that I was talking to, they're planning a global mass movement. They want to reach everybody, everywhere. And there was a meeting at the United Nations with about 700-800 people. But that was encouraging too, because many of the speakers were from agencies and NGOs and businesses and all that. But many of them were indigenous people who have developed their own projects. I mean, just one that just popped into my mind was a young woman from the Philippines her village was completely trashed by a tsunami. And she, a young, she was like in her teens at the time. She then put together a project where they're reforesting and planting cacao for chocolate, and really really reviving the town and giving people livelihoods after this tragedy. So there were just so many examples of people there. So I really got the sense that there's a very big space for the grassroots here. And that's what it's going to come down to, is the grassroots.
And so you wrote the book, Cows Save the Planet, in 2013. And so one of the things you in reference in the book is cows, methane, and all that hot air. So talk about the myth about how farting cows are causing global warming. Is a topic that's brought to the mainstream recently, as we heard with the Green New Deal and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So you break it down very well in your book, and so can you comment about this myth?
Sure. Okay. First of all, I have to say, it completely astounds me that this has become such a huge rallying cry for the climate movement when, first of all, I mean, okay, all right. So we need to distinguish between industrial livestock raising and animals on the land being managed appropriately. Because when you have animals on the land, let's say you have cattle on healthy grassland, well, on healthy pasture, in the soil there are microbes that consume methane. Here is the wisdom of nature. Methane is produced, there are organisms that are taking it up, so it needn't be a problem. But when you have cattle that are crammed in feedlots and just the numbers are huge and their waste goes into lagoons, that is a perfect scenario for the production of methane. So a lot of it does have to do with management. But then if you look at it, if you take another step back, the methane has gone way up. You know, like the methane going into the atmosphere has gone way up. Well, this has paralleled the fracking boom and more extreme measures to get energy. And the more that they're finding out, the more leakage there is in the production of natural gas. And so you wonder who is served by blaming cows. So, yeah, there you go. So that, I would say, is a huge, huge factor. But this myth just doesn't let go. I mean, I guess it doesn't let go because it isn't totally a myth that industrial livestock is a problem methane-wise. But really, yeah, we need to look at
the narrative.
Yes, change the narrative. Thank you.
So, can you share how we think of climate change and land degradation as separate and competing challenges, and how we should be framing our thinking to tackle our climate challenges in repairing our Earth?
Okay. Well, first of all, this is finally beginning to happen, but for the longest time, whenever anyone would use the phrase climate change, that in itself was a code for too much CO2 in the atmosphere because of the burning of fossil fuels. So it was all up there in the atmosphere. And land was forgotten. But if we open up how we think about climate change, climate is too complex a phenomenon to be determined by one factor. And land, so I got more deeply into understanding climate through writing about soil and the layer of, the layer of the earth. This is kind of a nexus. This is where the water cycle and the mineral cycle and the energy cycle and the carbon cycle are all happening, and all of those cycles are pivotal to climate. And climate change is a manifestation of the disruption of those cycles. So it's not merely carbon in the atmosphere, it's the loss of carbon from soil. it's also the distortion of our water cycle, which interacts with the carbon cycle. It's also the energy cycle. And when I mean energy, it's not necessarily that which runs our cars and heats our homes, but also what happens when solar radiation strikes the earth. And that's huge, because if the sun beams down on a healthy grassland, like the picture with more water there, then those plants are mediating and diffusing the solar energy by transpiration. That's the upward movement of water through plants, and that's a cooling mechanism. So we're kind of dissipating that heat. But if the sun beams down on a sidewalk or one of the before pictures that I showed you, then that becomes sensible heat. That heats up the earth because there is no water. I mean, there's no water. There's no transpiration occurring that is dissipating the heat.
So in terms of reframing our thoughts or our thinking around climate change, it's interesting that you use water as a verb and not only a noun. Why is it important to think that way, this way?
Yeah, okay. So when I was writing the book Water in Plain Sight, I was very much observing the way that we talked about water, and that was when there was a several-year drought in California. And I thought it was so interesting that all of the focus was about what does or doesn't come down from the sky. It was also water, like as if water were static. So there's, just as an example, there was one article that made the rounds and that everyone was quoting, and the headline was something like, "To get past the California drought, the state needs 11 trillion Olympic swimming pools worth of rainfall." And that just really made me laugh, because if you have all that rain and it comes down on asphalt and degraded land, and all the water just goes right back out into the ocean because it's not absorbed by land and plants and taken up by life, well, then you're going to find yourself in drought mode very soon. However, if that rain falls on very well-managed land that's holding the water, you might need only a couple of billion kiddie pools worth of rain. So the point is that water is dynamic, and it's also depends on, it's, in context with the natural landscape. And another thing is that I felt that it was really important for us to really bring in an understanding of water processes. So I mentioned transpiration, which is a cooling mechanism. Then there's condensation, which is what produces rain. And then there's infiltration, which has to do with whether land can take up water or not. And so these are active, and we can engage with the water cycle by promoting healthier water processes.
That's really good. So speaking of water, so how you talked about the water innovators in your book, Water in Plain Sight, and I'm curious to know sort of any updates about these innovators like across the globe that you could share with us?
Yeah, they're all doing really well. Okay, so one chapter was about the birds of Chihuahua, and that looked at how the connection between water and biodiversity. And the reason that I went to Chihuahua was that I learned that there were ranchers cattle ranchers that were working with bird conservation organizations to help support habitat for endangered migratory grassland birds. I thought that was really interesting because you don't always think about bird conservation efforts and cowboys. But that's exactly what was happening, because these land managers were reviving grasslands, and this allowed these birds to thrive, whereas a lot of that landscape, either it was being totally plowed up and, I'm sorry to say, poisoned by Mennonite farmers who were using a lot of agrochemicals, or the ranches were not managed well and they were going out of business, and that's why the farmers were buying this land. So what was really interesting was that it made sense that when you have a healthier water cycle, that allows for greater biodiversity. But what was also interesting was that greater biodiversity actually enhances the water cycle. And that was really, really interesting to really grapple with. I mean, even the birds. So you have more birds, those birds are dispersing seeds, which is enhancing biodiversity. And then the more worms, the more prairie dogs, the more all different, and beetles that are furrowing through the soil.
Everything is regenerating.
Yeah, they're creating pathways for the water to slow down and to filter through. And just one more thing about what's happening there. Our host, Alejandro Carrillo, is doing a beautiful job, and that he would show us some of the surrounding ranches that looked terrible. I mean, really, just, like a few little sprigs of grass, and you'd see a cow, and the cow looked hungry, and it was, I kept saying, well, why don't they do what you do? And he said, give it time. Give it time. And, I was just, why don't you tell them? So he told me about a year or two later that someone who owned, I think something like 1 million hectares, some huge, huge amount of land. The land there is very big, really. And that rancher went up to him and said, I want my land to look like your land. And now he is doing holistic planned grazing and is totally committed to restoring that land and having more birds and having more wildlife and all of that.
So, yeah, that's amazing. So you've been all over the world, and the stories are so interesting and diverse, and you could have decided just to do it in the U.S. alone. And so you opened our eyes to what's going on globally, and how I'm curious, how did you come to connect with these innovators? From someone from Western Vermont.
Yeah. Just that's the reporting thing. I feel really lucky that I've had really good reporting luck. I'm looking at my husband. Did I have any? I haven't had any real false starts, but a lot of it is serendipity. So one chapter in the water book, there's a couple who, they've since moved because of her husband's health. They were in far west Texas near Big Bend. This is a really rough rural area where everyone we met was running out of water. And what they did was they created a landscape that was run by condensation, that was run by dew. And so they got all their water from the way that they designed their barn, was that it maximized the differential. It was a metal roof, or it is a metal roof, differential between hot and cold, and that would create condensation, and so water would run down. And it's an incredible story that they knew that they were getting a lot of water from condensation, but it wasn't until one day in January, 3 months after the last rainfall, that their water tank overflowed.
Wow.
And they realized, wow. And Marcus got up the next morning at 4 in the morning so that you would get the coldest time of the day when the heat from the air earlier in the day from the sun, and that would collide with the cool air, and so he watched it, and it was really, really flowing. But how I just talked with Catherine at a conference, and I just really liked the way she talked about water. I was just really it really intrigued. You know, she said, we are finally attuned to all of the nuances of water. We are like the desert plants that way. And she talked about moisture events. So anyway, I just said, okay, I'm going.
That's great. Well, it's a testament of your journalism. So what can, so let's bring it down to the local level. What can we do on a micro level as individuals in our local communities, as well as regionally, for eco restoration? I mean, it's going to take a village, and so what can we every day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in New England, and you could talk about share what's happening in Vermont, New York border, in your community as a reference.
So this is a really big question, and this will really open it up. But what I will say first is that people are called to do different things. So there are people that are inclined to create, to apply permaculture in a community space, or there are all kinds of things one can do. But then there are also people that have other skills that they may want to use or apply towards this movement. So there are so many ways to tap in. And I'll just give you one example. Okay, so I showed the photos of the Loess Plateau, and John Liu, who is the filmmaker who documented the restoration, he has basically spearheaded a global movement of ecosystem restoration camps. And in the next book, I went to the first camp, Camp Altiplano in Spain. So now there are camps in Spain, in Thailand, in Bolivia, oh my gosh, there's an amazing effort in California. I'm sure you all know about the camp fire last year in Paradise, California. A friend of mine, a colleague, lost his home. So there's a permaculture guy out there that he chose to this happened. What can we do with this? So there is a program that is a now eco restoration camp that is specifically about responding to disasters, recovering after disasters. So one thing you can do, this is something I do, is I became a member of the ecosystem restoration camp. So 10 euros a month, there you go. So that's one way. You can, these are the armchair versions. You can, so there, I don't know if many of you know that there is a search engine called Ecosia. They plant trees. And that is my default search engine instead of Google. Google won't miss whatever. Yeah. ECOSIA. And I know that there's a lot of talk about planting trees. Planting trees is wonderful. It needs to be done in the appropriate ecological context, and that's what this group does. And they are active in Spain, in the area that I saw, and they're very highly thought of. Anyway, so there are a lot of, like I said, armchair opportunities. Then, okay, so in the area I live in Vermont, so there are people that have land that, it's rural. we suffer from not enough population, to be honest with you. We're losing population. So there are people that have land, and then there are people that have expertise. So what's happening now is that there's an agroforestry effort that is helping to connect people with land with practitioners, and that the purpose of it is that, so I know that in the agroforestry, so that's combining agriculture and forestry, and you're getting a lot of synergies between different kinds of plants, and you're getting products at different time scales and all of that, that it's a challenge for if one farmer decides, okay, I would like to have a hazelnut and this, and this crop. Oh, but how do we process the hazelnuts? That's a huge investment to do that. So, but if this agroforestry company is connecting all different landowners and farmers so that they can together share all the infrastructure for production. So that's happening in my part of the world. And then there's a beautiful regenerative farm and called Studio Hill Farm, where they have brought back some really dead land through using sheep. And they're also wonderful in terms of education. So education is a huge part. Talking to people, talking to farmers. Anyway, I know you have some wonderful ideas, so let's hear from you about how to get involved.
Okay, I'm a newbie to this, so but my pathway is in the space of local and sustainable food and food systems work within New England. And so when we were talking earlier today, thinking about how what resources are available, what assets that we have in our region. Do you want me to share about the Vermont goats?
Sure. Yes.
So I'm from Jamaica originally, and goat meat is something that's part of our culture. And in the greater Boston area, there is a huge demand for that meat. The Jamaicans curry it, Haitians roast it, Africans roast it, Haitians fry it, Spanish stew it, is halal. I mean, I can go goat 6 ways. And the interesting thing is that in Vermont, there's a huge creamery. Vermont makes its living a lot around the goat cheese. And so what happens to the goats? So just like humans, they're 50% of goats that are born are male goats, right? And so what happens, you don't need that many male goats for studs, right? So, so what happens to those male goats that you don't really need because, they're not milking? They go on to compost piles. That's what's happening. And so the female goats, after 3 or 4 years of milking, what happens to the female goats? They go on a compost pile. Yet Vermont, in particular in Burlington, about 30% of the population has immigrant from Burmese and Africa and different refugees and new Americans that eat goat. And so they've been going to the farmers where the creameries are and said, we want a whole goat, especially, and in a sustainable way. I mean, Jamaicans, we eat all parts of the animal. And so the interesting thing is that some of the Vermonters have realized that there's actually a market. Now, if you look in the Boston area, my issue is that where do I buy goat? Well, you can get goat in a reasonable price at Market Basket, where a lot of ethnic communities shop, because it's a little bit more affordable and accessible in terms of diversity. Now, guess where the goat that comes from, the goat that you buy, I don't buy it because it doesn't come it's not from Vermont. Where do you think the goat comes from that we purchase in Market Basket? Any ideas? Australia and New Zealand. Yet, we're composting goat in Vermont. Does that make sense? So ecologically, as well as just from a financial perspective, ecological perspective, cultural, social perspective, if we make the connection to have Market Basket sourced locally, which they're doing, but convince them to change their behavior and trade with Vermonters who have excess goat because they're using it, they're making money
And we
off
have
the creamery.
plenty of land.
And you have plenty of land to graze, and so that you can move around in a regenerative way, but making that connection. So there's a real need because you have a huge demand, but why do we have to go to New Zealand and all those miles when you have it right here in our region, right here in our region? So that's a business opportunity which some Vermonters have recognized, but we also in our movement have to educate and encourage the Market Baskets of the world, because you can get that goat that's $14.99 a pound in Whole Foods, but the volumes that for every day, I mean, people eat this every other day, can be, you can make a good amount of money. Now, to a Jamaican, a 3-year-old male goat is the most valuable goat. We use that for what we call manishwata, which is a very traditional thing you have at weddings, which I'll probably have at this wedding I'm going to. But to a Vermonter, a male goat is the least valuable. So here is something that's hugely valuable to a huge population within the Boston market and other cities within our region that is least valuable to Vermont. So that connection right there around using food and land and space. So for me, that's my pathway into this space.
Oh, and I just thought of another armchair opportunity, is investing in companies that are doing land restoration. So, anyway, there's a company called Iroquois Valley Farms that you can invest in. Anyway, so.
Just 5 minutes and switch to Q&A.
I think we're actually done ready for Q&A. I mean, my question was how to someone like me as a newbie who wants to join this movement connect, and you help me to figure it out. But others as well. Yeah. So, Q&A, open.
Who?
It's,
I've got a mic.
okay.
Well, we bring them to you have questions.
Since the United States is perceived as kind of the food basket of the world, I'd like to know how close are our farmers here in the United States to making a transition to regenerative farming and away from industrial monoculture farming? What do you see happening right here in the United States, which you didn't really talk about very much?
Yeah. There is a lot of movement. It's really hard to know. I met some people that are consulting, agricultural consultants, working in the Midwest, and they said that millions of acres are transitioning because land is failing. So it's hard to say because we're really at an inflection point where people in agriculture are saying this isn't working. I mean, the statistics of how people in agriculture are suffering right now because they're getting squeezed. I was in Kansas, and I mean, there's so much pressure for producers to lower the price of commodities, and it's not really feeding anyone directly. So, you have all this wheat that's going over to China, and then it comes back here in some packaged goods. but I know that there are companies that are talking about doing more regenerative work, and that's certainly lifting the profile of this. I don't think that in itself is large enough now, but I know that there are people shifting. It's like too in the thick of it to really, for me at least, to answer. Do you have a comment on that?
I don't.
Thank you. Sure.
I would say that it's a powerful motivator to change for many farmers, and there are enough out there that they have plenty of models, and they're getting more and more involved. There's a great article in the online magazine Politico in the past couple of days about farmers starting to feeling comfortable about talking about climate. And it's because they talk about climate without talking about climate. They talk about how it affects the farmer and what do we do about it. And regenerative agriculture is really the prime answer on what we do about it.
Hi, my name is Albert. Thank you so much for the discussion. Really learned a lot. So a question that's alive for me, talking about cows and blaming cows, it's an interesting discussion. So how does like the animal agriculture industry fit into all of this? Because I mean, there's a lot of different layers here, and so it's not black and white. And I mean, from my understanding, so much of the grains that are being grown are being fed to cows, right? And there is a lot of greenhouse gas that's coming from these factory farms. So, like, is the amount of meat consumption a problem? Is that related to this solution? I would appreciate your thoughts, both of you. Yeah.
I mean, I would say basically factory farming is a disaster on so many levels. I would also say that it depends on your ecosystem, like what does your land best serve? You know, so like we were in Hawaii, I have a chapter on Hawaii. If you're living in Hawaii, then your optimal diet ecologically would be fish and fruits and some other starches. If you live in inland New England, it might be meat like, lamb, goats, and, seasonal fruits. So it's just not simple, like less meat. It isn't necessary. There is meat that is from animals that are actively restoring the landscape too. So I don't know if I'm answering your question in a satisfactory way, but what I would say is important is that it's not simple, and it's also really important to understand that because something is plant-based, like plant-based proteins, that doesn't mean that it's ecologically benign.
Like almond milk?
At all. Right, at all. And even organic vegetables, like, or soybeans or whatever, the land that's cleared for the production of plant-based products, when you clear that land, then a lot of animals, a lot of wildlife is dying too. I mean, it's very complicated, and I guess it's incumbent on all of us to really be as close to the food to where our food is produced, so that we know. The farther away it is, then the less agency we have in in knowing what the impact of our choices are.
That I'd like to touch on that too. I mean, that's why I'm a locavore, and I believe that I believe in the vision that we can feed ourselves, the New England vision, 50% by 2060. Now, you would say, let's go for 100%, but we have a place to start. And I feel that if we can trade, if we look at New England as a trade kind of space, and, you know, Vermont has its role, and Maine has its role, and Massachusetts, we have the 3 largest cities within our region is in Massachusetts, so we're the eaters, you know, the demand side. And I feel that, yes, in order to meet that goal, I think we do need to eat more plant-based food. But at the same time, we have an abundance of seafood. We have 3,000 species within New England of seafood. And guess how much we import? 95%. Guess how much we export? 95%. So we need to eat what we have. We can feed ourselves on seafood. So we really need to change that dynamic, and you know, we have an abundance of things like Cape shark / dogfish that's being exported to London for fish and chips, which we can eat here. That's a very versatile product. And so those are some of the things that we can consider. That's in abundance. It's, you know, red fish versus trying to get seafood from the Caribbean. It's a good alternative. So if we start to change our eating habits, eating seasonally, eating locally, reducing the miles, we affect a trickle-down effect in terms of sustainability. And we don't necessarily have to replace meat, but we can replace it with what's local and seasonal to like I said, a ripple effect.
Thank you. This is really inspirational to hear about what can be done. I have a question that I fear might be a bit of a downer, and I hope it's not. I hope you've got a good answer to this. But everything that you've been talking about is what people can do on the grassroots level. What do the federal and mostly federal laws and lobbies have to do with how we can change the food system and how we can change land management? Because my understanding is that we're up against very heavy lobbying for factory farms, for industrial agriculture, and GMO, Monsanto. So can we just ignore all of that and manage the soil, and or how do we deal with, from the bottom up, with the oppression from the top down?
Okay, well,
and I don't want this to be a downer. I want this to be
No, just I don't know if many of you know this, but there are a number of states that have passed healthy soil legislation, and I happen to know someone who was really, really active in New Mexico, and they have probably the most, I'd say, advanced, progressive, whatever you call, legislation, because it's based on principles rather than practices. So sometimes when things are prescriptive, then that doesn't give people room to innovate, or people might kind of, you know, be frustrated by being told what to do. But because it's driven by soil health principles, it's very strong, and people are very committed. There were something like 200 organizations in New Mexico that supported this, and it passed unanimously. And they're very concerned about water. And my colleague and his associates did a lot of education to show that water management is driven by how we treat the soil. You know, that it can be done, absolutely. And then there's, of course, the Green New Deal, which has a lot of potential. And yeah, there's a lot.
I could add to that
Yeah,
too. I
please.
mean, and again, from my perspective, the food space, we are lucky in New England to be working regionally, first of all. And we share best practices. We share, with organizations like Food Solutions New England, Vermont Farm to Plate. Each state has a food policy plan within the region. We are advancing in New England compared to other areas because we're already working together, and which is extremely important. We have organizations that are advocating for local fisherfolk, fishermen and their families and their livelihood, livable wages, et cetera, like organizations like Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, which has changed their name to North American Marine Alliance, that actually fights big fish, just like how we have big ag, and fights and advocates for, they are also connected to the National Family Farm Coalition that are, again, promoting local, independent agriculture, diversity in agriculture, fair wages, et cetera. Don't underestimate the power of the grassroots, our voices, our political capital to bring about change. It's going to take a village, and it starts with individual, but we have been making progress. Farm Aid is located right here in Cambridge, and they are making international impact and have been doing it for many years with the leadership of Carolyn Mugar and many partners, and they've actually brought seafood as part of the conversation. So it's not just farmers, but the sea and the land. We have so much going on, and that's just in the food space. So I feel that I like to look at the glass half full versus half empty, because we are at a pivotal time to make change. And I'm not saying that, obviously we have barriers and we have to overcome them, but I look at those barriers as opportunities for us. Look at our youth. Look at our youth who are rallying around divestment of fossil fuels, the Green New Deal. They're our champions that we need to cultivate and support. So we're not in this alone, and we're lucky to have that energy that will really push things forward. So let's look at the glass half full and not half empty, because we've made a lot of progress. We have to do much more, but don't underestimate the power of our voices in this movement to influence and policy and change.
How about 3/4 full?
Yes, why not? Even 3/4 full.
So my question is, I guess some of the biggest questions for me are really around scale, scope, and also the time frame. So I'm based on the latest climate data and also the sort of extreme fragility that we've seen of industrial agriculture to climate shocks, things like that. It seems pretty likely that we're headed toward, widespread famine within like 10 to 15 years, perhaps sooner, if we don't really reshape the global food system. And so what are your thoughts about how we can get to the point, I know there's progress on a lot of fronts, but what are your thoughts about how we can get to the point of these like local regenerative agriculture, permaculture systems being able to, feed people on the scale of billions, and how we get there in like 10 years?
Okay.
So how do we really rapidly scale this up, I guess, is the basic question.
Okay, one thing I would say is that the fact that industrial agriculture feeds the world, that's a myth. That 70% of all of the world's food comes from smallholder farms in the third world. So they're already doing it. And I think that to begin to develop more community connections and for people to develop the skills and the networks and and to look at the obvious inefficiencies and disconnects in the system. I mean, I guess my answer is we do it. We and see where it's happening near you and how to tap in, and yeah, there are pockets of it everywhere, but yeah, no, it's important and it's real.
So I would look at a movement that I've been involved in. I'm involved in movements, and I started with the anti-smoking movement. Massachusetts was an international leader in this movement. It's not cool to smoke, maybe marijuana, but it's not cool to smoke in Massachusetts, and it wasn't overnight. It took a village, and it took policy, it took grassroots, it took healthcare, it took CEOs getting involved in the movement. It was a push-pull, young people, youth, and so if you think about that, we were able to change an industry that had big dollars, really, to fight big tobacco and win with little resources. We were able to do that. And so again, that's why I still have hope, because so we need to continue this movement and build on it and amplify it, our voices, and raise more awareness, because we can't wait. I understand that, we can't wait, but we have factors that affect us, and that's why it's gonna take a political change. Again, we need to use our voices, etc., but we can't give up. But the example of tobacco, it's a real example that we were able to stand up to big tobacco to bring about change. So I think it's possible. I don't think it's impossible, but it's not going to be overnight, unfortunately, and then we don't have a lot of time, but it's going to take, it sounds, simple, but it's going to take a village, to do that.
And to open up our imagination.
Innovation.
Yeah,
well.
and to really, food isn't necessarily what, comes in the package and what we're told. Just the example of the dogfish, that often what can feed us is right in front of us and we don't even know it.
So